I will close the door. All right, well, I think it's 12:01, so we should get started. Are we live and going?
Yep, we're
Awesome.
good to
go. Okay, so first I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today for this special edition of the PEDx Talk. I'm Melissa Mason with the New Mexico Pediatric Society. I will also just apologize for anything that doesn't run perfectly because our usual team is not here. So Matt, who was nice enough to step in and help out today, and there's Matt, we'll do our best, but it won't be quite as expertly executed as normal, so thank you for your patience. As always, I just want to thank Envision New Mexico for allowing us to host this. We're really excited today to be able to talk about the New Mexico Medical Home Portal. I would like to introduce Dr. Chuck Norlin. I guess before I do that, let me go over a few housekeeping slides. So Dr. Norlin, if you could advance the slide. So please know that this session is live and it is being broadcast. So if you could please mute your microphone on your telephone or computer. Video is on as well, although I don't see any other faces, just ours. If you would like to ask a question or say something, you can type that in the chat box or you can unmute your phone at that point. Okay, next slide, please. If you would like to receive credit for attending this or get a certificate, you have to announce your name or type it in the chat box during roll call. Your certificate will be emailed to you at the end of the calendar month. And yeah, we don't ask questions of you, so we can skip that. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. This shows you how to join the conversation. So to mute or unmute your computer audio. Next slide. And then just the disclosure, the normal disclosure on the CME and accreditation slide. One last thing, because this is live and being broadcast, we ask that you please don't include any protected health information. I think that is it. Next slide. We already said that. So at this time, we'll go ahead and take roll. So anybody who wants to either let us know you're there over your microphone or phone or in the chat box, we need to take some attendance. Okay.
All right. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you should be able to unmute if you're on a computer. The only person that shouldn't be able to is Julia, and I can't promote her to allow her to talk because she is using an older version of Zoom.
Okay. All right, great. Hi, Lene and Julia, we know you're here even though you are on mute. Great. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Chuck Norlin. He has practiced general pediatrics in Salt Lake City for 10 years before joining the University of Utah in 1990. He's continued to practice and has served as the Chief of Division of General Pediatrics until 2010. Since 2001, he has directed the Medical Home Portal and has done a lot of work around the portal, and we are really excited because the Medical Home Portal is started in Utah, but New Mexico is one of 6 states who is lucky enough to have access and to have their own portal. So we're really excited for Dr. Norlin to be able to kind of walk you through the portal to show you different ways to use it. We will have time at the end for any questions, so if you think of questions on any information you'd like to find or other resources, if you can save those till the end, we should have plenty of time to get to those. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Norlin.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. What I will try to do is give you an overview and introduction to the New Mexico Medical Home Portal and help you kind of see how it might be used in a real day at your office. Alas, I have no financial relationships to disclose. So this all started in 1998 when our chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics did a survey of its members, asking them, well, what would it take for you to improve the care that you provide kids with chronic conditions? And by far the top three answers were: one, guidelines for how to care for them. These conditions are oftentimes uncommon. I don't see many of them, and they're uncommon enough that, finding guidelines is really kind of hard. Knowledge of who in the community could help me, both medical specialists as well as other kinds of services that are helpful for those kids and families. And lastly, a care coordinator in our office. So we were inspired by the first two of those, didn't think the third one was possible. But with the help of a lot of serendipity, lots of folks, and a number of organizations, grants and contracts, we've been developing the Medical Home Portal since about 2001. And since we got started, we've been further inspired and driven by our parents and guardians who consult with us and guide us, and have advocated, convinced us of the need of those parents and guardians for information to help them care and advocate for their children also, and to partner with clinicians in the medical home model. And since, as Melissa mentioned, since 2013, we've partnered with New Mexico's Title V program and the University of New Mexico Center for Development and Disability to offer the portal's content, along with a directory of local service providers, which you'll see towards the end of this. This is our homepage. And and I should go back. So up here are the 5 major sections of the portal. I'll start off with the diagnoses and conditions section, which has one of my favorite pages, which is the diagnosis prevalence page. And here, if you put in the number of patients in your practice and click change size, the numbers in this column will change to reflect the number of kids you might expect in your practice with the conditions on the left. All of these prevalence studies are done in quite different ways, so I wouldn't put a lot of precision onto this, but you can expect this to be a relative guide to how many patients you might expect. And I think there's some very interesting things in here. So for example, autism spectrum disorder, several years ago, it was quite a bit further down the list. As the incidence increases, it keeps rising up the list. Tourette syndrome is something that's not always so obvious. I would never have guessed that I had 25 patients with Tourette syndrome in my practice. Down syndrome, the most common chromosomal abnormality, is uncommon enough that a general pediatrician might expect only 3 patients in their practice. Transgender adolescents, a diagnosis that we rarely made in prior years. Now we might expect to see 3 patients in a busy primary care pediatric practice with that condition. And then, further down the list, with fewer than 1 patient on average per practice, are many of the things we spent a whole lot of time in medical school and residency learning about how to take care of. But staying on top of all of these is very challenging, near impossible, which is one of the premises of the portal, in that helping pediatricians and other primary care clinicians get up to speed quickly when they do see a patient with these conditions is one of our goals. So I'll walk through what might be just another regular morning in your practice, and how the portal might play into how you function. So you arrive to the office in the morning after rounds, and you're huddling with your staff, and they have a list of issues for you. So the first one is the health department just called about Octavia. She's a 4-day-old with a positive newborn screen for methylmalonic acidemia. What do we do now? Next, a new patient this afternoon is a 5-year-old coming in for a well child check, and the schedule says he has Down syndrome. Is there anything special we should know or do before that child shows up? Also, Andrew, after a long stay in the hospital, just went home with a new tracheostomy, and the home care company called and needs orders and a letter of support for an inline humidifier for his tracheostomy. And then Maria, she's coming in today. Her son was recently diagnosed with autism, and she's been reading a lot of stuff on that internet and wants to know what of it is reliable. How does she find reliable information about not only his diagnosis, but planning for his schooling, how to help his siblings deal with this, and many other questions. And the Smiths are coming in tomorrow with Hank. their 8-year-old with cerebral palsy and seizures that are poorly controlled by his current meds. And they want to ask about using CBD. And then lastly, and then starting back at the top, so what do we do about Octavia? That's the 5-day-old with the positive newborn screen for methylmalonic acidemia. So if one goes to our newborn disorders section, you'll see on the left side a list of all of the conditions that for which newborn screening is typically done. And you find down at the bottom of the list, it's not the bottom, but it's the bottom of the screen, methylmalonic acidemias. And that takes you to a page that then shows you, tells you a lot of the basics that you need to know to respond to one of those calls from the newborn screening program. So you'll see that there's actually a bunch of different names and types of methylmalonic acidemia. Who knew that? Get a quick overview of the condition. And then most importantly, what are the clinical characteristics? So it sounds like there's a pretty variable condition, sort of depends on which kind of methylmalonic acidemia you've got, but some of those kids are going to be pretty severely affected. We look at the initial signs and symptoms, things that we might want to assess urgently, and then other conditions or symptoms that develop perhaps later on. And then how does one follow up on the positive test to make sure that it's a true positive and to sort through the types of MMA? And then what's the primary care management? What do you do on notifications? So it looks like we need to get this child in urgently to assess her. And then once the diagnosis is confirmed, what do we do from there, and who do we collaborate with in ongoing care? And we try to provide assistance on the portal to connecting with those other service providers. So for example, here we have direct links to information about newborn screening programs and pediatric genetics services providers. And if we click on that, we go to a list that lists the 2 providers of genetic services in New Mexico. So now we've got the information to connect directly with the subspecialists that we might need to help us manage this child's acute problem. So feeling like one of our staff has their task understood and they're off to call the parent, get the child in, and make perhaps preliminary connections with the newborn screening program and genetics, we now address the second problem. So that's our new 5-year-old patient with Down syndrome. So if we go to that previous list of the diagnoses in the portal, where there's 54 of them, we find Down syndrome. If we click on that, we see the menu for all of our diagnosis modules. And the menu goes on a little bit. You'll probably see a little bit more of that in another few slides that break down the sections of each of the diagnosis modules. And our hope is that these reflect how primary care clinicians and practices think. And we'll notice early towards the top of the list there is practice guidelines. So if we click on that, it'll take us down to that section. And we find here there's actually an article on health supervision for children with Down syndrome, but it's 2011. We're not so sure that's going to be what we need. But then we notice up here, though, it was reaffirmed in 2018. So sounds like that would be a reasonable place to look. We provide a full text link, which then takes us to the article. And in the article, you even find a table that tells us, well, for the child with Down syndrome at various ages, what do we need to know or what do we need to do? And it tells us that. Yeah, that's not the most helpful format, perhaps, and it's deep in this PDF. Is there any sort of better way to look at that? And if we look down here, lower on the menu, we'll find clinical tools, and that's going to be in each of the sections. Well, maybe there's going to be something there, and lo and behold, there's a Down syndrome checklist, which if we click that, we come up with this form that was created from the same guideline set, but oriented in a way that enables us to actually use it in a chart, or at least on paper, to identify when things were done, and helps guide our eye to what needs to be done during a given age visit. And this actually goes up to 18 on other pages of the same checklist. So that might be helpful for us to get ready for this afternoon visit. And then we glance further down that list of items in the module, and we find that here under treatment and management, we've got things called pearls and alerts. And so let's look at what those are. So each of our diagnosis modules, we ask our subspecialist authors to identify some of those pearls, which we think of as things that, well, only a specialist is going to know this by virtue of having seen, hundreds of these kids over years, but might be hard to find in an average textbook. Or what are the alerts, those kinds of things that if you're going to take care of a patient like this, you really ought to know about so you don't miss something of importance. So, well, it looks like there's some interesting issues here that we might want to come back and look at later, either while we're seeing that patient or afterwards. And then there's also this section called Managing Common Problems in Patients with that condition. So here we've got several categories, kind of like our systems that I'll show you in a second, of categories of care or concerns that, well, if the child has this syndrome, in this case Down syndrome, we might want to think about a problem in that area, such as growth or weight gain, development, viral infections, etc., a little bit differently. So we try to get our authors to provide concise guidelines on, well, how should you think about those things differently, and provide some instructions on how to move forward. And then within the treatment and management section, the rest of it is broken down into systems, as you can see listed here. And so the first one in this situation is cardiology, providing a brief overview of the cardiac complications of Down syndrome, and then has links to more information. And then also we include, well, what are the specialists or other specialty kind of services that you might want to consider when seeing a child with a problem in this area with that condition. And then for each of those, we provide a link to find more information about those services in your area. And way down on that list of systems, we find complementary and alternative medicine. And there, you'll notice we don't have a list of service providers. That's something that in Utah and our other collaborating states, no one's felt comfortable listing because we don't have a lot of evidence about how those are provided. So unfortunately, we don't list providers of complementary and alternative medicine in the portal. That's not to say we won't in the future, but currently we don't. And then we also have a section called Related Issues. So we don't have any currently for Down syndrome other than writing letters of medical necessity, which we'll come back to later. But there you oftentimes find information that goes into much more detail about things that probably are too detailed to include in the general module, because we try to keep that as concise as possible to make it easy to access that information. We also include a section for Ask the Specialist where they offer information about well, what are the common issues that they hear about from primary care clinicians, and how might those clinicians approach those in care. So, we feel like we're on track for preparing for our child with Down syndrome, and now we come to Andrew's home care company needing orders and a letter to support that humidifier. So if we go to the for physicians and professionals section, we'll find on the left side general information that can be very useful for the medical home. So how do you build a medical home, care coordination, common issues. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. A little bit of information about education in schools, feeding and nutrition. We try to compile health supervision and practice guidelines for health supervision. And then under medical technology, we've got a few things that are common in kids with special healthcare needs, tracheostomy being one of them. So this page provides a brief information focused at the primary care level about tracheostomies. And indeed, it provides information about humidification. So that can give you some guidelines on what kinds of orders you might need to write. But then, we may not be all that comfortable writing a letter of medical necessity. So if we go up to the top and use our search bar to look for medical necessity, we'll find a few links. And if we click on our page for writing letters of medical necessity, then we come to a page that goes into details about how to write such letters. What are the components that ought to be included to make it a compelling letter? What are the special circumstances, such as in equipment requests? So that might actually be pretty useful. And at the bottom of every page, we include information and support, generally divided into information for professionals and information for families. For professionals, you'll see here links to other websites that provide information about letters of medical necessity. And under the tools, you'll find actually a number of sample letters that could be used as templates for letters that you might want to write. So that might actually be pretty helpful to get going. So you'll assign one of your staff to help you get some of that information handy. And then Maria, she wants to know about finding reliable information about her son's autism, planning for his schooling, how to get help for his siblings. And our For Parents and Families section is actually one of our larger sections. It has an extensive menu here of information that families can use from every stage of their managing their child with special needs, from before a diagnosis, kind of wondering what's going on, how do you seek a diagnosis, once you've got a diagnosis, and you'll notice each of these has some more extensive submenus underneath them. How do you get early services? How do you deal with education in schools? And a lot of these are going to be pretty relevant for this family, including caring for your other children. And then for each of the diagnosis modules that we also have a diagnoses and conditions frequently asked questions that's focused for a parent's needs. So the first place you might refer the family would be to the autism spectrum disorder, where we have sort of stock questions that our parent consultants have helped us come up with for each of the diagnoses, and then oftentimes specific questions that are focused on just that diagnosis. So these are oftentimes very helpful as an introductory way to get families familiar with the diagnosis, what the assessment and treatments are, and how to find more information. At the bottom of each of these pages, we duplicate many of the resources that are listed on the physician's diagnosis module page. And many families really appreciate reading even those more detailed diagnosis module pages. We think that's very helpful partly because they get more detailed information, but also they get more familiar with the language that we clinicians use in practice, so they can be more conversant with this and really be better partners because we can share information at a more detailed level. And as a physician, you might say, well, I don't know that much about how to work with the schools. Maybe there's something under this section for me. And indeed, there's a relatively shorter section, but it goes into detail at the primary care for the clinician level about educational services, the IDEA Act, 504s, IEPs, developing a health plan. So things that can help us as clinicians help our patients and families navigate the world of education and getting the services that their children need. And then the Smiths are interested in knowing what about use of CBD for Hank's poorly controlled seizures. And I'm not certain what the status of CBD use in New Mexico is, but we do have a page that goes into detail about it that I believe at the bottom it has some links to find out how to get more information for different states. We've actually had a fair amount of activity here in Utah. It's legal as of this year's legislative session. So we're getting a lot of queries from patients about how to use this mode of treatment. So we've got something that we can learn from and something we could even refer the patient and the family to learn more about CBD and its use for those seizures. and this goes into more detail. Talks about discussing CBD with families and specifics about how to use it, including some pearls and alerts for us as clinicians. And then one of our most useful sections is our services directories. So each of our partner states has their own services directory where we partner with folks in that state to develop the list of service providers. And in New Mexico, as I mentioned earlier, we do that with the CDD, and they've been staunch partners for 6 years now. So in the services directory, we have a number of different categories. I think the potential categories are somewhere on the order of 280 different categories that address services ranging from pediatric subspecialty services to services for families, such as educational services, assessment services, adoption and foster care, as you see there, advocacy, clothing, housing, a lot of information about funding sources. So we think that it's a valuable way to find out what's available in your community to help you and your families. Just a few of the more clinically oriented categories are shown here. We identify specific pediatric condition-specific clinics, a variety of more general resources, pediatric subspecialists, pediatric surgery, healthcare-related services such as arts therapies, audiology, music therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, testing resources. And as I mentioned, funding assistance, a variety of places to go for that. Mental health is, I assume it's true in New Mexico, is challenging to find good resources for kids, but this is a good place to start. And this is an area that we're going to be working on to revise how we approach this in terms of how we categorize service providers, and we also intend to add the ability to ask providers to tell us what problems they focus on or what problems they feel particularly adept at managing, so that we can list that and have the services section searchable by those criteria. Then we offer information about recreations, particularly for camps, like, for example, for camps for children with special healthcare needs, a variety of support services, transition services, transportation, etc. And then we also have the ability to develop lists of providers. So we imagine that this would be particularly useful for a parent of a child who wants to keep track of all the providers that they have heard about or have accessed already, or even more so for care coordinators in clinicians' offices who want to develop lists that they would then could share with patients, and perhaps develop many lists that are focused on different diagnoses or different zip codes. And we're redesigning this to make it much more user-friendly as we speak. Hopefully that will be ready in a few months. But you can see here that on my page, I've got several lists that we've created. And if you click on the list, then you go to the section in the portal that has your selected providers, and then you can share that. You can rename your list. You can copy it. You can send a copy of that to other people, or you could print it just using the browser print function, and it creates a much more readable approach or format for those lists. Many of the providers have more information than I showed, depending on what kind of information they provide to the agency from which we get the data. And then on all of our partners pages or portals, we have a Get Help in Your State page where it lists our partners and how to get in touch with them to get more information. So just clicking that will get you to a page that helps you. And then the contact at the bottom of every page gives you a list of our team here in Utah. So you can contact us if you'd like to get information, or you can use our feedback button that will give you an online email contact, and you can contact us that way. And I actually finished that faster than I thought I was going to, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and maybe even get you back a little bit of time for your day. So I'll come out of there and open it up for questions.
So we're unmuted.
Yeah, we're unmuted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I learned a lot, and so that was really helpful for me. So I will first open it up. Does anybody participating want to ask a question, either through the audio or through the chat box? While we're waiting, I have a couple. So one is, if we know of a provider who we feel like should be listed on the portal or a service on the portal, how would I put that or recommend somebody to add to the portal?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So I'm on the site now. You're seeing this, right?
Yes.
So right here in the services directory, there's a link for suggest a new provider. So if you click that link, then up comes a screen, and all we really need is to know who you are so that we can contact you if there's questions, and the name of the provider. If you can provide us more information about that provider, that would be great. And I'm glad you asked that, particularly because this shows you the kind of additional information that we have available for some providers when we get that from the organization that gives us the information. And as I mentioned earlier, the CDD in New Mexico is the one that provides us this information, and they keep it up to date. So another way to approach it would be to contact them, but they get the information entered into here. So that's going to be the easiest and quickest way to do that. Just use that suggest a new provider link.
Great. Julia Hecht has a question, but I guess she wasn't able to put it on the computer, so she texted me, and she asks, is there a tutorial or learning module for the portal?
There is. And so if you go to the About link at the bottom, then let's see there. This says a section I honestly don't visit that often, so I have to look for it.
Chuck, it's the guide.
Oh, the guide. Thank you.
It's at the bottom. Sorry, it's at the bottom as well, next to About.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. So if you click on the guide to the portal, then you'll get to how to use the portal, and and there's the video series on our YouTube channel.
And this is Linnea from the Medical Home Portal team. I want to add that I actually just watched all these videos last week. They're still pretty much up to date, but we have made some changes. So you might see a few things in a slightly different location. So don't be taken aback. You're still in the right place. And we will look at whether there's more adjustments that need to be made. But
And that was Linnea Bauer. She's our main liaison with our partner states, and she's listed on our contact page. So she's a great person to contact if you have questions about how to use the portal. Feel free to contact her directly.
yes, happy to.
Great. Thank you. So we have another question from Tammy Broxson. She says, is this already available to refer parents to? And we already refer parents to the site. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And we very much, and I mentioned here that we very much welcome parents looking at the site. And for anybody who's looking at it, we thrive on feedback. So, of course, we love positive feedback, but that's not as helpful as negative feedback or ideas for how to improve the portal. So please feel free to use that contact button or the feedback button to give us feedback as you share it with others or use it yourself. And since I'm on the family section, just to take a couple minutes to show you a little bit more. So under the, after a diagnosis, information about, well, how do you accept the diagnosis? How do you work with your other family members around that? You know, how do you care for kids with special healthcare needs? Lots of detail about that. Helping find providers, both specialists and therapists and dentists. You know, what do you need to know about early services, education in schools, got to frequently asked questions, information about, you know, taking advantage of Section 504, bullying, very common problem in kids with special healthcare needs. Transitions are huge, so not only from, you know, various grade levels, but also to college and on to adulthood. Lots of information about that. We have a section on assistive technology that many parents find it useful, adaptive cycling, driving, etc. Taking care of yourself and your family. A variety of other needs, such as recreational activities, social opportunities. Here's that section on diagnosis of conditions I mentioned. Mental health. And we have a section called Story Central where parents can actually read other parents' stories, and we're very open to getting stories from new parents who are using it. And then, of course, finding funding is very challenging for many families. So we offer a lot of information about that.
That is great. Thank you. So I know that on the site there's already a lot of information about pediatric subspecialists. I will just plug one piece for the New Mexico Pediatric Society's homepage for our website is that we have an ongoing monthly updated list of the subspecialists and surgical specialists, both at UNM and Presbyterian, on our home website. So I know there's a lot of information on the portal, but through those institutions, there's a lot of turnover and changes. So we do have that. We're also working to add care coordinators to the Pediatric Society webpage, as well as private practice subspecialists and surgical specialists. So that's another place to also look for providers if needed. So I did have a question. Yeah, I'm sorry.
If you can get us, help us figure out where to put it, we'd be happy to post a link to your page too.
Okay, yeah, we can certainly work on that. I think the more places that's listed, the better. And so just to get back to the list, because I think that's a really helpful thing, could I, for example, have different lists? So could I have a list of, say, mental health providers, counselors that I typically recommend on one list that I could print and give to a family, and then maybe have another one for speech therapy or hearing screens? I mean, could I have multiple lists that I could just then print out to give to parents while you're in the room, say?
Absolutely. So just signed in. So you do have to sign in to do that, and I have multiple sign-ins. So this one has fewer lists, but yes. So your list would be compiled on your list page. And then you could have as many lists as you want to make up. And then each time you want to share it, you would have the alternative of sending an email or a text to that patient with the URL for that list, or you could go ahead and print it out. So if I say, okay, I want to take my autism list here and print it, then I can just go ahead and print that out as is. Or if I was to send the patient the URL, which is not easy to remember, but I send that as a link, then every time they clicked on that, they would see the most updated information on each of these providers. So if that list is, you created it a year ago, it might have different information on, addresses or phone numbers or things like that. So it would have updated information if you shared the link that way.
And then where at that place do you create a list? Or is that just?
So by clicking new,
okay,
then you can go ahead and start creating a list. And then all you do is go to the services directory, and you can do a search, or however you approach it. You click a category, and you then choose the provider. And we do it by category of service. So some providers are listed with multiple kinds of services, others with just one, but the lists are organized by category of service. So you would save that provider to the list, and then they would show up on your list as that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And then I guess, what have been the sections that have been most recently updated? Because I know that you guys there's ongoing updates across the portal. Are there any that have been the most recent ones that you wanted to share?
Linnea, can you give me the...
Yeah, so I believe the most recent updated diagnosis module is the 22Q.
Right, that's right.
That's the one that was just updated, I believe, last week or maybe the week before. We are always, and Dr. Norlin can speak more to it, but we're always updating these modules. So, you're getting constant updates here. So some other ones that are fairly new, cystic fibrosis was just launched at the end of 2018. We've done
help from New Mexico on. Yeah.
Yes. We've done updates relatively recently to depression, I believe to Down syndrome.
Yes, Down syndrome was just a couple months ago also.
Yeah. I think, trying to remember one of the epilepsy related ones, I think. Sorry, I'm trying to look at your screen and I can't.
Okay. But I will point out that at the bottom of every diagnosis module, well, at the bottom of every page, we let you know how recently it was updated. And then there's the author. You can find out more about the author just by clicking on their name. And the authoring history, when there's a substantial one, will be in there, so you can see how often it was, who contributed to it in the past, and what their roles were.
And actually, if you go to common issues, we have a new common issues page, I believe it was just published today.
Oh, really? Which one was that?
Probably before you were on the, it's the puberty and puberty related.
Ah, right. Yeah. And just to show you a couple of the other things in here. So common issues at this point is really sort of a mishmash of things that have we've found a need for, or we've had an author volunteer to write for us. So you can see here we've got information about formulas, rather extensive information about that, about calcium. I showed you the medical technologies earlier. In screening and prevention, we have a number of issues, including lead exposure, developmental screening, dental and oral, maternal depression, prevention of TBI, screening for sleep problems, etc., and toxic stress screening. And we also have a section on transition issues focused on physicians that's much shorter than the one for parents. And asking about recent updated diagnosis modules, there are a few that I regret to admit are a little bit old, some as old as 4 or 5 years. Because all of our authors are volunteers, sometimes it's hard to herd those cats. But we expect to have virtually all of our modules updated by sometime this fall. But most of them are under 2 years or 3 years old.
So what I hear you saying is this is a very dynamic site. There's always something being updated or added, and that it's really useful for providers, it's useful for families, and we should all have this on our homepage of our computer as we're in the room working with families, because we can find what we need as well as directing them to find what they need. But I also, I know personally it's nice to get this kind of an introduction and a tour, and because there's a lot on the site and can be overwhelming. So it is helpful to maybe either pick a patient that you can think of and try to find the information that you could have used for that patient, but just to start to use it, because I know that it can be kind of onerous, but once you actually get on the site and start using it, you see the value in the just incredible amount of resources and information there. So I really thank you for walking us through that and showing a lot of different areas that I actually didn't know were on there. So I appreciate that.
Our pleasure. And if you look for something and don't find it, let us know. We recognize that if a system doesn't work for you all the time, it's hard to come back to it and try it again, even if it's going to be useful sometimes. But the more feedback we can get about priorities of our users, the better and more quickly we can address those.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any more questions. So with that, I will again say thank you, Dr. Norlin and Linnea, who's always been a wonderful resource. And Mindy, you guys have been a fantastic team to work with. And thanks so much. And thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Take care.
You too.